The exchange began like many others Trump had been part of before, filled with rehearsed confidence and his familiar rhythm of responses. Yet there was a subtle difference in the way Jasmine Crockett carried herself as she leaned forward to speak. Her voice wasn't raised, nor did she carry the fiery tone so many of his opponents usually relied on when confronting him. Instead, she was calm, so calm, in fact, that it almost unsettled the air in the room before she even said a word. Asterisk viewers expected the usual sparring, accusations from Trump, a pushback from the other side, and a moderator trying to keep the noise under control. But Crockett's tone broke that pattern instantly. It was measured, deliberate, and free from theatrics. Each word was delivered like a carefully placed stone, steady and impossible to ignore. The power didn't come from volume or exaggeration, but from the ease with which she exposed what she knew, leaving Trump without the chance to prepare his usual counterattacks. Asterisk Trump had built his public persona on dominance, a figure larger than life who always had the last word. His rallies thrived on energy, his interviews on control, and his debates on outshouting whoever sat across from him. But Crockett didn't give him the opportunity to overpower her. She didn't rise to his interruptions. She didn't match his tone. She didn't even glance away when he tried to cut her off. Instead, she stayed locked on him, her words cool and calculated. The contrast was striking. The louder he grew, the quieter she became, and that quietness forced the audience to tune in more closely. Asterisk as she began unveiling family details, there was no drama in her delivery. She didn't sensationalize. She didn't pause for effect. She simply laid them out as if reciting facts from a public record. It was this composure that magnified their impact. Every viewer knew they weren't watching someone exaggerate for a headline. They were watching someone reveal truths that had been buried, without emotion clouding the delivery. Trump, who thrived on turning conflicts into spectacles, suddenly had no spectacle to lean on. Asterisk when he tried to interject, Crockett didn't raise her voice over his. She waited. Her silence during his interruptions only highlighted his inability to rattle her. And when she continued, she picked up exactly where she had left off, as if his outburst hadn't existed at all. This demeanor undercut his usual strategy, stripping him of his strongest weapon, the ability to dominate the room. For perhaps the first time on live television, Trump found himself not in a battle of volume, but in a battle of composure, and it was a fight he wasn't prepared for. Asterisk, the audience reaction was telling. Social media lit up with comments about how calm she remained, how different it was from the chaos people were used to seeing in debates involving Trump. Her restraint carried more power than anger ever could. It framed her as the steady voice of reason while painting him as reactive, cornered, and unsettled. The optics mattered, and in this case, they tilted in her favor. Asterisk Trump, on the other hand, struggled visibly. His frustration wasn't just with the revelations but with the manner in which they were delivered. Anger would have been easier to handle if it had come in the form of a shouting match. He excelled in that arena. But her refusal to engage in the typical back and forth left him flailing for footing. His hand gestures grew more animated, his words more clipped, his patience visibly slipping as he tried to counter someone who seemed immune to his usual tactics. Asterisk the calm attack worked because it was unexpected. For decades, Trump had conditioned opponents to believe that the only way to go toe-to-toe with him was to fight fire with fire. Crockett flipped that logic upside down by refusing to meet him on that battlefield. Instead, she carved her own ground, one that forced him to react on her terms. The more she stayed composed, the more unsteady he appeared. And in the world of live television, perception was everything. Asterisk by the time she finished her points, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The crowd was no longer waiting for his punchlines or his trademark retorts. They were watching his discomfort grow in real time. Crockett hadn't just delivered a blow with her revelations, she had exposed his inability to withstand a calm, focused opponent, and it wasn't the content alone that stung him. It was the way she had chosen to deliver it, stripping away his usual power and leaving him reacting, rather than controlling. Asterisk would you like me to now expand Keynote 2 in the same 700-word storytelling style, keeping Trump mentioned throughout? When Jasmine Crockett shifted the focus from policy to Trump's personal world, the atmosphere in the studio shifted with her. For years he had crafted an image of a strong family man, surrounding himself with children who carried his name into business, politics, and media. It was part of the brand, part of the empire, and part of the shield he carried against criticism. But on live television, Crockett began to peel away at that image, calmly drawing attention to fractures that had long been whispered about but never spoken. So clearly in front of millions of viewers, asterisk her words were sharp in their simplicity. She didn't speak in rumors or speculation. She pointed to public disputes, legal filings, and documented fallouts. She mentioned how not all of his family members had shared the same loyalty he projected, how financial disagreements had spilled into the open, and how behind the scenes, the empire wasn't as unified as he claimed. The effect was immediate, not because the audience was hearing something scandalous shouted in sensational tones, but because they were hearing it quietly confirmed, piece by piece, without hesitation. Asterisk Trump's reaction was visceral. He had been challenged on policy, lawsuits, and controversies before, and he always managed to turn those moments into battles he could spin in his favor. But the mention of his family was different. His face hardened, his jaw tightened, and his voice rose with unusual sharpness. He dismissed her statements as fabrications, attacked her credibility, and accused her of crossing a line. Yet the more he insisted, the more attention it drew to the very subject he wanted buried. His anger only gave her words more weight. The power of that moment came from the vulnerability it exposed. Trump's family had been one of his strongest defenses, a living symbol of loyalty and success that he often pointed to as proof of his legacy. Crockett, however, calmly suggested that loyalty wasn't as solid as it appeared, and success wasn't always shared evenly among them. She referenced reports of family members distancing themselves, of disagreements over money and property, of instances where the brand had seemed fractured. For the first time in that broadcast, Trump seemed less like the man in command and more like a father and husband, suddenly forced to defend the most private parts of his life in front of a national audience. The audience felt the tension. Viewers could see the discomfort on his face, the way his usual confidence slipped into agitation. His hands moved restlessly. His voice cracked as he repeated words with growing frustration. Crockett's composure, in contrast, only deepened the effect. She didn't raise her voice, didn't resort to insults, and didn't respond to his anger with anger. She kept her tone steady, as though she were presenting a case in a courtroom, with facts on her side and no need for theatrics. Trump tried to fight back, launching into monologues about loyalty, love, and family unity. He spoke about the strength of his children, the role they played in his campaign, and the way they had stood by him through years of criticism. But the longer he spoke, the clearer it became that he was scrambling to patch over cracks that Crockett had already exposed. The very act of defending so vigorously made viewers wonder why he was so rattled. Crockett's strategy wasn't just to expose secrets, but to target the image he valued most. She didn't need to argue about tax plans or foreign policy. She went for the foundation of how Trump wanted the public to see him. By questioning the strength of his family unity, she called into question the very brand he had spent decades building, and because she did it with calm certainty, she left no room for him to dismiss it as wild attacks or partisan noise. For Trump, this was more than a political jab, it was personal. He prided himself on being the patriarch of a powerful dynasty, someone whose name carried weight because it was shared by his children and reinforced by their presence in his business and politics. To have that image dismantled in real time, in front of millions, was a humiliation he couldn't easily shake off. His explosion was not just anger at an opponent but frustration at being cornered in a way that struck beyond politics and into his private world. As the segment ended, the silence in the studio was telling. Crockett had managed to do what few had ever accomplished: pierce through the armor of Donald Trump by exposing the fragility of his most prized possession, the narrative of a united, loyal family. The cameras captured every detail: the redness in his face, the sharpness in his tone, the defensive hand gestures, and those images would circulate far beyond the broadcast, carrying her words with them. Would you like me to now expand keynote 3 into the same 700-word storytelling style, with Trump mentioned throughout? The moment that defined the broadcast wasn't just what was said, but how it unfolded in real time. Live television has a unique power because it strips away the safety nets of editing, rehearsal, and damage control. When Jasmine Crockett began pressing Trump with her revelations, there was no opportunity for him to call a team of advisors, no chance to spin the narrative before it reached the public. It happened unfiltered, and the cameras captured everything from her calm delivery to his eruptive response. From the very beginning, the debate had carried an undercurrent of tension. Trump entered with his usual bravado, smiling for the audience, gesturing with confidence, and firing off quips that drew laughs from his supporters. He was comfortable in that arena, feeding off the energy of a live crowd and the unpredictability of live questions. But Crockett's shift changed the rhythm. When she turned her focus to his family, the silence in the room deepened. The moderators leaned back, the audience held their breath, and millions at home leaned closer to their screens. Live television turned her words into something more than accusations. They became a shared national moment. Trump was accustomed to controlling live broadcasts. He often set the pace, dominating airtime, interrupting opponents, and steering the narrative back to himself. But this time, Crockett's strategy prevented him from dictating the flow. She refused to be rushed or interrupted, calmly continuing her points as if his protests were mere background noise. The audience saw the shift instantly. Trump was no longer the man orchestrating the spectacle. He was the man reacting to it. Every second mattered. His facial expressions, his tightening grip on the desk, the flashes of irritation in his eyes, all of it was broadcast without filter. In an edited interview, such moments might have been trimmed or reframed. On live TV, however, there was no escape. The rawness of his discomfort was visible to everyone, and social media lit up with clips and screenshots within minutes. The speed of the broadcast amplified the effect. What Crockett revealed wasn't just being heard, it was being dissected and shared in real time. Asterisk for Trump. That loss of control was unbearable. His brand had always thrived on creating his own narrative, deciding when and how stories were told. He often used rallies, press conferences, and interviews to stage manage his image. But in this moment, Crockett had seized the narrative, and the cameras made sure he couldn't wrestle it back. His angry outbursts, intended to shut her down, instead painted him as defensive and rattled. The contrast between her composure and his agitation played out like a split-screen lesson in control, and viewers didn't need commentary to see who was steady and who was struggling. The moderator's silence made it worse. They seemed hesitant to intervene, knowing they were witnessing something rare. Without interruption, the live exchange played out with no filter, no redirection, and no pause. Trump's explosion was broadcast in its entirety, and the authenticity of it, emotional, unguarded, gave Crockett's revelations even more weight. The impact of that moment was immediate. Commentators later noted that Trump had faced scandals before, but almost always in environments where he could reframe the story. Live television stripped him of that advantage. It was like being caught under a spotlight with no exit, every twitch of frustration and every slip of tone magnified for millions to see. Crockett's decision to bring her revelations into that setting wasn't accidental. She knew that live TV meant permanence. Once the words were spoken, they could never be retracted, edited, or spun. The audience sensed the historical weight of it too. Many viewers later described the experience not as watching a debate but as witnessing an unmasking. For years, Trump had portrayed strength and control on screen, but here was a moment when the mask slipped, and it slipped in front of a live national audience. Crockett's.com precision against his fiery outbursts highlighted the cracks in his persona, and live television ensured the entire nation saw it unfold without filter. Trump's frustration only deepened when he realized the conversation was no longer about policies or platforms, it was about his reaction. His explosion had become the story, overshadowing the points he tried to make later in the broadcast. Every attempt to pivot back to familiar talking points sounded hollow compared to the rawness the audience had already witnessed. And because it was live, there was no way to undo it. The moment existed now in the public record, endlessly replayable and impossible to erase. By the end of the program, it was clear that Crockett's calm attack had worked, not just because of what she said but because of where she said it. Live television amplified the effect, trapping Trump in a space where every gesture and every word counted. He had built his career on controlling the screen, but on that night, the screen controlled him. Would you like me to now expand Keynote 4 in the same style, keeping Trump woven throughout at about 700 words? Trump had always prided himself on being unshakable, someone who could walk into a hostile room and bend it to his will. His reputation was built on confidence, bravado, and a refusal to ever show weakness. But when Jasmine Crockett began pulling apart the image he valued most, what the audience saw wasn't the man who usually thrived under pressure, it was someone unraveling in plain sight. The breaking point came not from policy disputes or political jabs, but from the moment his family, the very heart of his public identity, became the subject of exposure. At first, he tried to brush it off, waving his hand as though dismissing her comments would be enough to neutralize them. His voice carried that familiar mix of bravado and disdain. But there was a crack in it, subtle at first, that attentive viewers immediately picked up on. The more Crockett spoke with calm certainty, the more he began to falter. His interruptions grew sharper, his volume louder, his tone angrier. What he didn't realize was that every raised word, every exaggerated gesture, was reinforcing the image of a man pushed beyond his limits. For Trump, control was everything. He knew the power of perception and spent years ensuring that cameras captured him at his strongest, whether on a rally stage or behind a debate podium. But this time, Crockett refused to let him dictate the energy of the exchange. She kept her voice steady, her words deliberate, and her demeanor unflinching. In doing so, she forced him into a position he hated most, reacting instead of leading. The more she maintained her calm, the more he seemed to spiral. His breaking point became obvious when he leaned forward, his face flushed with frustration, and launched into a furious tirade about loyalty and lies. He gestured wildly, pointing toward her, then toward the moderators, then toward the cameras, as if the blame could be spread anywhere but himself. His words blurred together, heavy with anger but light on clarity, and the audience could see the contrast. Crockett, composed and controlled. Trump, visibly rattled. It wasn't the first time he had lost his temper on television, but this moment was different. This wasn't a staged rally where supporters would cheer his every word. This wasn't a controlled interview where his team could cut away or demand edits. This was live, raw, and entirely unfiltered. The very thing that had once elevated him a mastery of media spectacle was now working against him. Cameras caught the redness in his cheeks, the way his hands slammed against the desk, the clipped and repeating words that betrayed his agitation. Crockett didn't need to shout back. She simply let him speak, giving him enough space to unravel. On his own, Every time he paused for breath, she resumed with quiet precision, reinforcing her points with a calm that seemed to dig deeper under his skin. His explosion wasn't just a burst of temper. It was the culmination of being cornered in a way that stripped away his defenses. For once, his usual strategy's mockery, interruption, dismissal failed him. Instead of silencing his opponent, he ended up amplifying her. Viewers at home recognized what they were witnessing. Social media exploded with comments about his loss of composure, clips replayed endlessly that highlighted his angry gestures against her steady gaze. Analysts remarked that this was one of the rare times he had been caught off guard so completely that he couldn't recover during the broadcast. His breaking point was no longer just a moment of anger. It had become the story itself. What made it even more damaging was how personal it felt. Political battles were one thing. Trump was used to being attacked over policies, scandals, or lawsuits. But when the subject turned to family, it struck at the part of his identity he had spent decades carefully building. To see that image challenged, and then to watch himself explode in response, gave the public a glimpse of vulnerability he had always worked to hide. His fury wasn't just about being confronted. It was about being exposed in a place he thought untouchable. By the end of the exchange, it was clear he had lost control of the moment. Crockett hadn't needed to overpower him with volume or rhetoric. She had simply stayed calm and let his breaking point reveal itself. For Trump, it was a rare instance where the mask of control slipped, and once it slipped on live television, there was no way to put it back on. Explosion was more than anger. It was a sign that even he could be rattled when someone dared to strike at the personal instead of the political. Would you like me to also craft the ending statement in 500 words in the same storytelling style, wrapping up all 4 keynotes into one closing flow? The broadcast ended, but the shockwaves from that night didn't fade when the cameras switched off. Millions had watched a moment that felt less like a debate and more like a rare unmasking. For years, Trump had defined himself by strength, control, and dominance. His presence on stage was supposed to be untouchable. His words meant to overpower anyone who challenged him. Yet what unfolded with Jasmine Crockett revealed something entirely different, an image of a man shaken, stripped of his defenses, and reacting to a calm attack that pierced deeper than any fiery exchange ever had. Crockett's method was the key. She didn't storm onto the stage with dramatic accusations or heated rhetoric. Instead, she stayed collected, her voice steady, her tone almost conversational, as she laid out facts that cut at the very foundation of his persona. Where others had tried to fight fire with fire, she extinguished his flames by refusing to meet them with more heat. Her calmness forced him to supply the drama himself, and in doing so, he revealed just how unsettled he had become. The family revelations mattered because they struck at his pride, his legacy, and the image of unity he worked so hard to project. Trump had built an empire not just on business and politics, but on the idea of a dynasty, a family bound by loyalty to his name. Crockett's exposure made viewers question that narrative, and his explosive reaction only reinforced the doubts she planted. By losing his composure, he made her points more believable, giving weight to her calm words without her needing to repeat them. Live television amplified everything. The world didn't see carefully edited sound bites or rehearsed statements. That saw raw emotion, unfiltered gestures, and the clash between steadiness and fury. It was the kind of moment that couldn't be rewritten or spun away. Every second of his visible frustration became part of the public record, replayed and dissected across platforms long after the debate ended. In a way, the cameras didn't just capture a debate, they captured a turning point in perception. Trump's breaking point stood out because it showed something rare: vulnerability. He had spent decades convincing the world he could never be rattled, never be cornered, never lose control. But that night, the mask cracked. His explosion wasn't just anger, it was a window into the one thing he couldn't control. Someone exposing truths about his personal life in a setting where he couldn't bury them. And once the audience saw that side of him, it was impossible to forget. The night belonged to Crockett not because she shouted louder, but because she understood the power of composure. By staying steady while Trump erupted, she flipped the balance of power on live television. What started as another political showdown ended as a moment of exposure. One that will be remembered not for the policies debated, but for the image of a man unraveling in front of millions. For Trump, it was more than a debate. It was a reminder that even the strongest armor can crack when